Let's take a look at setting up your audio device within Studio One, and we'll begin on the Start page. By default, Studio One will automatically select an audio device based on what you have connected to your computer, but at any time we can change this device or make adjustments to the currently selected device. We can see here that currently Studio One is set to use Windows Audio, which makes use of the built-in audio card on my laptop, but I've got a Focusrite audio interface that I'd like to use because it provides a lower latency and more inputs than what is available from the laptop. By moving away from the built-in computer audio hardware, we can make use of balanced quarter-inch inputs and outputs, XLR inputs with preamps, high-Z inputs, as well as optical ins and outs if your audio interface supports them. In most cases, we can also achieve higher sample rates, such as 96 kHz and above, from using a separate interface. So in order to set up a new device, we would simply click on Configure Audio Device, which will open up the Audio Device tab within our Options menu, and we can make a new selection from here. Of course, you'll want to be sure that you have installed the necessary driver for your interface, and be sure that it's connected to your computer before attempting to use it with Studio One. Now, by clicking on the Audio Device drop-down menu, we can make a new selection from here. And if you are working on a Mac, you will actually have two areas where you can individually select your playback and recording device. So just be sure to make your selections for both areas as you'd like it to be set up. I'm going to select my Focusrite from here, and we can then see that the display below updates to show the new settings for our device. And to the right, we have a control panel button, which will take us to the proprietary software for our interface, and this will allow us to make adjustments to its settings. What you will see is going to vary depending on your interface brand and model. For me, working with the Scarlett Solo, I have a simple window where I can set the sample rate and buffer size. But we can also set these parameters within Studio One, and that's what we'll do for this example. I'll go ahead and close this window out. Now, the first field we have below our audio device selection area is our device block size, which is essentially our buffer size and determines how much latency or delay we will experience when recording MIDI parts or when recording audio and monitoring that audio with effects like reverb. Typically, a setting of 256 and below will provide the best performance for tracking, but it's important to experiment a bit to find what works best for your situation and your computer's processing power. It's also important to remember that lower block sizes will provide you with less latency, but they will stress your CPU more, and as you continue to lower the buffer size, you may experience audio dropouts or distortion within your audio. If you are on a slower system, one useful thing to do would be to utilize lower buffer settings while tracking your song, and then increasing the buffer size during the mixing phase. We have a slider for adjusting our block size, or a drop-down menu which I'll use to set the buffer size to 128 samples, but before I make that change, take note of our current latency times in the display below, as these will be reduced after lowering the block size. And we can see clearly that the times have improved, keeping in mind that this again will be a bit more intensive on your CPU. Within Studio One 4, we do have another tool that we can make use of to deal with latency issues on slower systems or songs with high track counts and effects, and this can be found within the Processing tab. And while going into depth on all of the features of the Processing tab is beyond the scope of this tutorial, just know that you can make use of dropout protection, and this will treat our recording as a separate process than playback. And in this way, if we are working on a slower system, or again, a song that may have a high track count and lots of effects, we set higher buffer sizes for the playback of audio, but still keep our lower buffer size for recording when we make use of the dropout protection. Note that while we are set to minimum for dropout protection, our block size is the same as that of our audio device tab. And even if we move it up to the low setting, we retain the same block size. But once we move to medium and beyond, we can see that the buffer size for playback of audio increases, but our audio device block size for recording still remains the same at the lower setting. The last area to be aware of on the Audio Device tab is the Release Audio Device in Background setting. By default, this is not checked, and what this means is that Studio One will maintain exclusive control of your selected audio device. So if you were to open another application like a media player or a web browser, they will not have access to the audio device you have chosen within the menu above. If you would like other applications to have access to the audio device while Studio One is open, then you'll need to be sure to check this setting. And then in that way, if Studio One is not the active application, the audio device will be available for use by other programs. So we've covered choosing your interface and setting its buffer size, but what about setting the sample rate, bit depth, and input and output options? For this, we'll go ahead and create a new song. And we can see on the new song dialog window, we have the option for setting the sample rate here, which I'll set to 48 or leave at 48, as well as our bit depth, which I'll leave at 24-bit. And we can also set this within our song by coming up to the menu and choosing from the window here. And it's also within the song setup window that we can make adjustments to our inputs and outputs, which we can access by clicking on the Audio I/O Setup tab. At the top, we have tabs for managing our inputs and outputs separately, and we'll start with setting up our ins. Keep in mind that what you see here is going to be dependent on the model of interface that you're using and how many ins and outs it has. I'm using a Focusrite Scarlett Solo, which is a simple interface that only has 2 ins and 2 outs. So looking at our input matrix here, the top horizontal row represents all of the physical inputs that are available on our device. So I have the 2 that are showing. And on the left, the vertical row lists what will be available or show within Studio One and our song specifically. The blue boxes represent bridge connections between a physical input and what's listed in Studio One. So if these boxes are removed, the connection is then broken. If you're working with an interface that has a lot of inputs, you'll want to be sure that you click to create a box at the junction of the hardware input and the software representation along the vertical column. In my case, I've only got the 2 inputs on the Scarlett Solo, and there are 3 inputs that will show up within the song. We can see those here. 1 stereo input, which makes use of both input 1 and 2, and then 2 mono inputs, 1 and 2, which also make use of the hardware inputs 1 and 2 respectively. If we'd like to name these inputs to make it easier to identify them within our song, we can simply double-click the name and input a new one. I'll just call the stereo inputs stereo in. And for the mono inputs, I'll name the first one mic 1 and the second instrument 1, as it is a 1/4-inch instrument input. And if you have more than 2 inputs on your audio interface, you can create new software inputs for those as well, if they weren't created by Studio One. We would click on the Add button in the bottom left corner, being sure to choose whether you want stereo or mono. I'll create a new mono input, which will be redundant as I only have 2 inputs on my audio interface, but you can see how this can be created. And then you just want to be sure that you are clicking within the matrix to bridge the connection to whatever additional hardware input you'd like it to be matched with. We can remove the software inputs as well. So since I don't actually need this, I can just click once to highlight it and then click the remove button. Lastly, we have a Make Default button so that after you've set everything up as you'd like, you can click on this button to have it be the default I/O setup whenever you create a new song. If you're planning on using the same interface and mic setup, this will be incredibly useful for saving time when starting new songs, and you can set up everything at one time and then you're done. Now let's finish with the Output tab, and this is going to function exactly the same as the Inputs tab, but we're just dealing with the outs on our device. And as I've mentioned, my interface only has 2 ins and 2 outs, so we can see that we are showing those 2 outputs here. We can add and remove additional outputs as we saw with the input section, and we also have a Make Default button as well. Finally, we have an audition setting, and this allows you to set a specific output for playback of audio from within the browser when you're auditioning loops and audio samples. By default, it's set to main, but if for whatever reason you don't want the audition sounds to play back on your main monitors, you can set a different location here. Of course, your audio interface does need to have more than the 2 outputs that I have, as with my case. Otherwise, main is going to be the only option that is available. And so this is how you can go about setting up your audio interface within Studio One 4.